Hello, my name is Andrew Wyckoff. I'm the Director of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak at this webinar on the right to privacy in the digital era and misinformation in times of pandemic. This is clearly a timely and important event given the resurgence of COVID-19 infections around the world, but particularly across OECD member countries. The OECD has published over 135 different COVID policy notes. They're available on our webpage, and they're designed to assist countries to better address and combat the pandemic underway. In fact, my part of the OECD has published specific COVID policy notes on everything from privacy, security risk, consumer protection, mis- and disinformation, and track and trace apps. I encourage you to read them. In particular, our work has emphasized the importance of timely, secure, reliable data collection, access, and sharing, both within a country's borders and outside of it. Data sharing is critical for us to understand the virus, its spread, and provide people with reliable information on everything from masks to homeschooling to the status of ICU beds. In fact, data has been instrumental in improving the effectiveness of government policies and fostering global cooperation in efforts to develop and eventually distribute a vaccine. To assist in containment and recovery efforts, countries have been investigating the utility of digital technologies and data sharing agreements, including track and trace technologies that track the movement of citizens and the virus. The increased reliance on data collection, access, and sharing raises significant privacy and data protection challenges. I'd like to use the example of track and trace as a lens into the broader issue of digital privacy in times of pandemia and extract a few key messages for your consideration. In the context of a pandemic, privacy frameworks, including the OECD privacy guidelines, which date back to 1980 and are currently under review, provide a framework that facilitates data sharing that's both in the interests of national security and public security, including public health and welfare. Let me posit three principles that are drawn from the guidelines that are key to the use of data in times of pandemic, using track and trace as a concrete example. First is the importance of integration of privacy in the design of track and trace apps. This has been a priority for many governments. The efficacy of these apps depend on their widespread use, which in turn is dependent on engendering trust in the apps. Without trust, widespread adoption won't occur. Applying the OECD privacy guidelines, there are four key features that a privacy protecting app should have. First, data collection should be necessary and proportionate. Data collection must be the minimal amount needed to achieve the purpose. Some countries have determined they don't need to collect data themselves for these apps to function, so rather they've adopted a decentralized approach where location data is not collected on a central server. Some countries have also used the proportionality test to make decisions that it's not necessary to collect the names of individuals, but rather to assign randomly anonymized user IDs, or rely instead on general identifiers such as age and sex. The second point is that of data minimization. Data should only be used for clearly defined, limited purposes, and only retained as long as necessary to achieve that purpose. For example, data collected by Singapore's Trace Together app is deleted automatically after 25 days. Australia's COVID Safe app stores data for just 21 days. The third point is that of transparency. The public should have access to clear information regarding the app's data collection. Ideally, the app's source code should be open source, such as that in Italy. Lastly, sharing the data ideally ought to be voluntary, although data may also be collected for other legitimate, lawful reasons, such as those in the immediate interest of public health. I'd like to reemphasize the key principle of proportionality. In the first few months of the crisis, there was a worldwide scramble to develop track and trace apps. What we're now seeing, however, are a lot more questions being asked about the efficacy of these technologies. For example, are these technologies actually more efficient than manual contact tracing? Do we need a particular threshold of population to download these apps for them to be effective? And what is stopping people from downloading these apps? At the OECD, we suggest that countries conduct proportionality assessments to be able to justify the collection, processing, and retention of movement data. The outcome of these assessments will and should differ across countries and regions and over different time periods in the COVID-19 recovery efforts. The concept of proportionality touches on the issue of surveillance more broadly. It's important to recognize that the current crisis won't last forever, and that extraordinary surveillance measures introduced now should be for a limited time period, that limited to the emergency at hand. My third and last point focuses on data sharing arrangements. Recent work by the OECD suggests that few countries have existing policy initiatives to facilitate data sharing, especially those with the private sector. And even fewer have data governance frameworks in place to support extraordinary data collection and sharing measures in ways that are fast, secure, trustworthy, scalable, in compliance with the relevant privacy and data protection regulations. During COVID, many governments have passed or are about to pass laws specifying what data may be collected to assist recovery efforts and how it should be used. We've heard from many countries that they have found it particularly useful to seek advice from privacy enforcement authorities, private sector law firms, civil society, academics, other actors to ensure that these laws are necessary and proportionate. Privacy enforcement authorities, or PEAs, across many countries have generally endorsed a pragmatic and contextual approach and have reinforced the fact that respect for fundamental data privacy and protection principles do not stand in the way of necessary and proportionate frontline responses to COVID-19. Let me conclude with some key messages for your consideration. The first is data protection and privacy are important and have become even more so during COVID-19. Data protection and privacy frameworks should support rather than impede a country's ability to respond to COVID-19 efficiently and effectively. However, it's important for countries to keep these frameworks in mind, particularly the OECD privacy guidelines, which set out minimal standards. It is particularly important for designing track and trace apps and entering into data sharing arrangements. It is likely that implementing privacy by design into track and trace apps will instill greater trust in these technologies, which may result in higher downloads of the apps. In many countries, such as Australia, Singapore, and the EU, the privacy of these apps is part of a national dialogue and something that citizens are very aware of. Policymakers should seek advice from privacy enforcement authorities to ensure that any data collection is necessary and proportionate. And as much as possible, policymakers should involve the private sector, civil society, academics, and other stakeholders in these discussions. We're all in this together. Let me thank you for your attention and wish you a successful conference.